One great disappointment of photography initially was we went to the Niagara Falls and I photographed, the falls with my camera. I was so disappointed with the result. The image of the falls was nothing like the reality. And that, I think, was my first realization of how different what is represented through photography is from the real. My name is Knorr. I was born in Germany and grew up in Puerto Rico in the 1960s. I grew up in a neighborhood that was a mixture of white European American professionals and I would say mixed race Puerto Ricanos, So in my schooling as well, I was hanging out with people, Puerto Ricans. I was learning Spanish, so I also speak Spanish. And when I arrived, though, it was very strange, I spoke German. Because before going to Puerto Rico, my very early education, nursery, was in Germany, in Frankfurt am Main, where I was born. So it's like, in a way, I'm thinking about that early childhood, very active, very curious, definitely not feeling any limitations concerning gender, having a lot of confidence because of my class background and white privilege, because it really is about that. The culture that surrounded me when I grew up was my mother's influence. She collected books, she collected art. There was very beautiful European furniture in the house that she imported from Europe when we moved to Puerto Rico. And my father was an international businessman who had set up a business on the island because he wanted to change his career and he was doing other things in Germany. So he took the family when I was 4 years old to Puerto Rico. So the influence really was in my work. Literary influences were like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, of course, magical realism. The people that I was close to were independentistas. So I grew up with that 1960s generation of, I guess, to an extent, challenging, questioning, and also rebellion in a way. I was a very rebellious young woman. So I had a very free childhood, near the sea, with mixed, in terms of culture, again, different foods, Latin American food, European food. My parents were great cooks, a lot of parties, very sociable. When I was 9, I was given as a present a Kodak Brownie camera. They're really simple, and they have CC 6 centimeters by 6 centimeter frame, and you just click, it's like a box, yeah? And I used to take it everywhere with me, especially when we would go visiting my grandmother, who was a professor of biochemistry in Detroit, USA, and I would take my camera around. And one great disappointment of photography initially was we went to the Niagara Falls and I photographed, the falls with my camera. I was so disappointed with the result. The image of the falls was nothing like the reality. And that, I think, was my first realization of how different what is represented through photography is from the real. So, and then later, my mother actually was a photojournalist who wrote for the Stars and Stripes in Frankfurt am Main just after the war. This was a newspaper run for the American Armed Forces. And my mother took photographs and also wrote, long articles about the denazification of Germany, also the Nuremberg trials and things like that. And my father at that time was one of the editors of the Stars and Stripe. This is before the decision was then made to change life, change everything, and go to Puerto Rico. So there is that, again, this environment, especially in the case of my mother, of photographies there. I grew up with the Time Life books. I grew up with National Geography. I grew up with these subscription magazines that gave me a taste of other places, also about all the different types of photography that one could get engaged with. After my high school graduation in Puerto Rico, I studied for a year in the United States with Eileen Cowan, who is, still a practicing photographer. She's based in LA, and that was the one tutor that really stood out for me. I also studied philosophy. I enjoyed that. So already at that point, I guess I was developing a taste for critical thinking and some sort of interest in theory and what challenges it could produce to the consensus. So 1 year in Franconia College, which was an experimental college formed and run by the youngest president in history. He was 23 when he opened the school. He is now the principal or the director of Bard College, and he's also a composer and a musician. So he's called Leon Botstein. And it was run in a sort of communitarian way where everybody took votes together on which teachers would continue their contract and which didn't. Very interesting the way the school was run. The way I was taught photography was very much more experiential, less theoretical than later, and very much expressive. So the photographic image was seen as an expression of a certain artistic sensibility. And I experimented in different processes from gum bichromate to solarization, etc. It's learning, it's very elemental learning. So that was really the beginnings of photography as a fine art practice. So it was already a viewpoint on photography that was growing in the United States. In Paris, it was through surrealism that you had this fine art experimental practice. In the United States, I would say it was more of a romantic expressionist, sometimes also influenced by surrealism, very much influenced by pop art, very much influenced by Robert Rauschenberg and alternative processes, which Eileen Cowan introduced us to. And of course, the introduction of Diane Arbus, and that trajectory in photography, sort of got my curiosity going. So very early, when I must have been 19 when I started Franconia College, and I left at 21. Where I went next was very strange. I came back to Puerto Rico quite rather upset at not feeling that I really wanted to go back to Franconia. I felt it was a bit limited, and my father, in a conversation, proposed, well, you're French, why don't you consider going to Paris? And my mother had a very small pied-à-terre, which was like a chambre de bonne, that I could stay, that she was renting. And so I said, yes, why not?